Don't want to retain God in my knowledge because I don't want to be accountable to Him. I don't want to worship Him. I don't want Him to be greater than me. Okay? Put it together. They don't want to recognize God for who He is, the master of their life. This is what they don't want to recognize. They don't want to think about Him and they don't want to worship Him. Let me just pause for a minute and say this about what he's saying here. Worshiping anything besides God is called idolatry. Okay? And idolatry is not a logical choice. The Word of God in the Old Testament, God often explains this to the children of Israel. And He uses extreme language to explain it. He says, why would you worship these dumb idols? And He talks about eyes they have, but they cannot see. Arms they have, but they cannot touch. Feet they have, but they cannot do anything with it. They have mouths, but they don't speak. And He's showing the illogical nature of idolatry. It doesn't make sense to worship idolatry. Well, we don't worship. We're so advanced. In our culture today, we don't worship those dumb idols. No. Headlights they have, but they cannot see. Doors they have, but they cannot open by themselves. Vacation homes, but they cannot populate themselves. Whatever. Okay, we do have idolatry, right? We do worship stuff. Maybe it's not the carved out wood idol of the tribe, but it is the same thing. It's not logical, though. It makes no sense to worship the sun, right? It makes no sense to praying to a statue. It makes no sense to adore a vehicle. It makes no sense to adore a motorcycle. Got to throw myself in this one. And it makes no sense to worship the intellect. It makes no sense to worship human reasoning. It's not logical to think that I can be worshipped. The reason I bring this up is, if you think about it, look at the mess people make of things. Both in macro scale, world wars, yeah, we should worship man's intellect because that's really done a great job toward promoting peace, hasn't it? And then on a micro scale, marriages and relationships, we're really good at that too. It makes no sense to worship and adore man's intellect. It makes no sense to worship and adore science. We're supposed to be the most evolved species? It just isn't logical. It's not reasonable. And my reason is not the greatest. But at least if I'm honest, I have to admit that my mind, my reason, and my science is not worth exalting. I know my frailties. I know my faulties. Atheists and agnostics are really those people that are afraid to be atheists. They just don't know if God exists. Well, make a choice, They like to make people think that they are God deniers because of their intellect, their reason. They can prove God doesn't exist. And many are very intelligent too, but their intelligence in logic does not make them atheists. That's not why they're atheists, not because they're intelligent or because they're logical or because they're reasonable. Their intelligence makes them proud and unwilling to worship anything but their own knowledge, and that's why they're God deniers. It's pride. It's not because their intelligence is so great. God is a threat to their personal intelligence. There's a competition there. God is a threat. They cannot abide another who is greater, and so they seek to slay the knowledge of God. They don't want to hold God in their knowledge. God in turn gives them up and allows the full glory of man's reason to flourish. And what we have here is the full glory of man's reason flourishing. I mean, this is not a smoking gun against, for an apologetics for the presence of God. But I think a really good proof that man's reason cannot be exalted is we've been working for a long time in this world to make things better. And I guarantee you that if you were to ask majority of people today if things are better today than they were before, years before, most people would say, no. Man's reason, man's intelligence, humanity, the creation cannot make things better. Therefore, the creation is not worthy of worship. Not worthy of worship. God says, you don't want to recognize me? Let me show you what your worship of creation produces. This is what it produces right here. Vileness, perversion, immorality, murders, hate. Man's problem is not that Christianity is illogical, but rather that he is unwilling in his natural state to allow anyone or anything to compete for preeminence in his own little world. That's man's problem. Going back to the text, what leads man to think that he can choose to worship something other than God? Remember, he doesn't want to retain God because he doesn't want to worship God. What leads him to not want to worship God? Verse 21. Because, this is why, the cause of creation, the cause of revelation. When they knew God, these two things, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. They know God is real and that God is the authority, but mankind naturally refuses to do two things. They refuse to glorify God and they refuse to thank God. And that produces self-worship, which produces a rejection of the presence of God, which produces perversion and vile and the wickedness we see. So, following it all back, what is the root cause of all this vileness? Refusing to glorify God, refusing to thank God. That's the result. I mean, that's the root that brings the result that we see here. So I ask the question again, how important is it to give thanks? It's the root problem in sending people to hell. Refuse to glorify God, refuse to thank God, this is what it produces. God has revealed His person and His work through creation, through conscience, through the gospel, making man without excuse and submitting to God's authority. However, because they refuse to glorify God and will not be grateful, they are increasingly growing in vanity and conceit in their thoughts. Their heart is getting darker and darker. They refuse to glorify God, neither were thankful, it says. And as the heart grows darker and the mind gets more and more vain, they foolishly, although they fancy themselves to be wise, exchange God's glory for nature and exchange the truth of God for a lie. And God allows them then to be more vile. The nature which teaches one man and one woman for one lifetime becomes skewed, he says here. And they cannot nor will not admit sin, so they do everything they can to remove the knowledge of God. Because if I don't have a God, I don't have sin. From life, public and private. Why? Why do they do that? Because they refuse to glorify God and will not be grateful. God keeps giving them up to themselves to do as they see fit, to receive the natural consequence for their lifestyles, and they're being filled with more and more wickedness. Everything from gross immorality to disobedience to parents to inventors of more and more wickedness to gossip and slander. All these are mentioned in here. And this is the natural progression of unregenerate man. It's a headlong plunge into decadence and perversion. Why? What's the root cause of such vile and perverse behavior? They refuse to glorify God and refuse to thank God. We come to the end, and now it says in verse 32, they understand the truth. They know the truth. They know they should be glorifying God and thanking God, but refuse to do so and take glory in others who will not as well. Mankind knows this is all a facade. This vile behavior packaged up as good times is an effort to erase God's authority. It's an effort to erase God's structure from life. They know the judgment of God, but refuse to acknowledge or respond to it. There is no excuse. Why not? Because they refuse to glorify God and refuse to thank God. The root of depravity and spiritual decay is found in whether man is willing to seek the glory of God and whether he is grateful to God for the gracious gift He bestows. That's the root. This passage is referring to unbelievers, the unregenerate. I know this kind of text is offensive. It is offensive. Most of the world would rip Romans chapter 1, actually probably the whole book of Romans, but primarily Romans chapter 1 out if they could. Very offensive. Don't shoot the messenger, right? Remember though, this is how God is describing the pattern and the direction of the unredeemed. But let me ask a poignant question in the light of the seriousness of this text. Is gratitude important? Is the glory of God important? It is so important that the absence of it leads to depravity and vile and the grossest, deepest kind we can find. I propose that if being ungrateful to God can produce such a vile lifestyle in an unbeliever's world, cannot an ungrateful spirit produce great spiritual trauma in the life of a Christian too? Do the rules sometimes somehow change for the Christian?